How did African Americans come to be? Although some of their ancestry may have originated in Europe or Native American tribes, the vast majority of African Americans trace their ancestry back to Africa. Research showing that African Americans have 73.2% African, 24% European, and 0.8% Native American DNA lends credence to this theory. Because of this, everyone thinks that black slaves are their ancestors. How about if we point out that it's incorrect? That is what you have been told on purpose. Nearly all African Americans, 98%, can trace their ancestry back to Native American communities, according to research. Then why did they deceive you, and what are they trying to conceal? In this video, we will discover the answer. Prior to Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, tens of millions of native black Americans, or more accurately, Indians, lived in what is now known as the United States. But they vanished without a trace just after 1492. However, where were they all taken? Slaves from India ended up in many African and European countries. Then it hits us. All this information we've heard about the slave trade is completely backwards. As opposed to a great migration of Africans to the Americas, black Indians were brought to Europe from the Americas. Spain then sent them to Africa for use as a commodity in trade for natural resources in Africa. The black Indians, who were later returned to the United States under the false pretense of being African Americans, were enslaved. Schools frequently omit teaching students about this important period in our nation's history. Indian slaves were used for building, plantation work, and mining by every European nation that colonized North America. Hosts in Europe and the Caribbean received these slaves on a regular basis. The best evidence for this practice can be found in historical records, especially those from South Carolina, the original English colony of Carolina that was founded in 1670. It is believed that the English sent at least 50,000 Indians to their Caribbean colonies between 1650 and 1730. In order to evade paying taxes and tariffs, many shipments were hidden. It was more common to export Indians than Africans between 1670 and 1717. More so than natural disasters or conflicts, slavery wiped out entire indigenous communities along the coasts of the South. Conscripting Indian slaves to fight in colonial wars was made mandatory by law in 1704. Colonial powers' plans for economic control ensnared Indians long before the American Revolution. Many Indian communities were severely impacted by the fur trade, the English plantation system, the Spanish mission system, and the Florida system. Native Americans who had been uprooted by the fur trade headed south. To protect themselves from slaves in Spanish mission towns, plantation owners armed them. Slavery was a tool of imperial power politics in the United Kingdom, France, and Spain. In exchange for amicable relations, military alliances, and the emancipation of slaves, they reached an agreement. For instance, in Georgia, where the Chickasaw were besieged, the British established relations with them. As a means of controlling Indian populations and thwarting French attempts to arm them, the Chickasaw tribe engaged in widespread slave raids in the lower Mississippi Valley, selling their captives to the English. Interestingly, the English perceived this as a superior means of so-called civilizing the natives when contrasted with the missionaries from France. From what was formerly Spanish New Mexico all the way north to the Great Lakes, the Indian slave trade extended. According to historians, every single tribe in this enormous area was either a slave or a trader in the slave trade. One of the main goals of the depopulation strategy that allowed European settlers to settle the land was the institution of slavery. If you enjoy our videos and would like to see more like this one, please consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the like button. We are seeking your support as we strive to establish a robust community. Alright, carry on. In 1636, following the Pequot War, which resulted in the slaughter of 300 Pequots, the remaining Pequots were enslaved and transported to Bermuda. Among the most important ports for the slave trade were New Orleans, Boston, Salem, and Mobile. English, French, and Dutch ships transported Indians to Barbados, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and the Antilles, respectively, from these ports. Another destination for Indian slaves was the Bahamas, which were referred to as breaking grounds. From there, they could be sent back to either Antigua or New York. When not transported far from their homelands, Indians were considered as lowly slaves, according to historical accounts. They made short work of it and sought safety with other Indian groups. Additionally, many of them perished from diseases brought over from Europe while crossing the Atlantic. Barbados outlawed indentured servitude to Indians in 1769, pointing to their too bloody and dangerous an inclination to remain here. However, how does this establish that the majority of Black Americans trace their ancestry back to native Black Indians? In the late 1700s, when the African slave trade began to supplant the Indian slave trade, Native American women started marrying African men. The result was a generation of children whose Native American heritage was gradually lost due to this practice. Through bureaucratic changes in public records, these individuals of mixed race were referred to as colored people, as part of the colonial project's effort to erase the presence of Indians. It was common practice to change people's race from Indian to colored on public documents in states like Virginia, even though they were originally recorded as such. Because they judged people by their appearance, census takers often incorrectly labeled people of mixed race as Black rather than Indian. Therefore, there is a Native American population today that is largely ignored by mainstream culture, especially in the Northeast. Additionally, this provides more evidence that modern-day Black Americans and Native Black Indians are identical. According to the United States Dawes Roll Administration's documentation on the Dawes Roll cards, they are in a similar situation as the freedmen of the Cherokee and other 5 civilized tribes. Native American Indian tribes received nearly $1 billion in a historic settlement in early September 2015. Settlements totaling $940 million were achieved by 645 Native American tribes in their disputes with the United States Department of Justice. More Native Americans, those who were born with the race designations colored, Negro, Black, or blank on their birth certificates, may learn their actual ancestry, which the United States government feared. This finding has the ability to persuade the government to provide them with land and reparations. To sidestep this problem, the United States covertly set December 31st, 2014 as the deadline for these people to assert their land and identity claims. Despite the passage of time, the U.S. Supreme Court, and more frequently, UN courts continue to grant settlements to thousands of Native Indians. Where exactly did those Black Indian Americans originate from remains an open question, though. Up until this point, it has been proven that the majority of Black Americans today can trace their family tree back to Native Black Americans. However, the identities of these Native Black Americans must be revealed. The pioneering viewpoint on human origins is provided by the esteemed historian Dr. David Imhotep, who was the first to receive a doctorate degree in ancient African ancestry. He maintains that the American people, like all humans, have ancestral ties to Africa. This perspective questions the conventional wisdom found in U.S. history textbooks, which frequently begin with cowboys and Indians. Dr. Imhotep argues that these narratives omit an important and earlier part of American history, the impact and presence of Africans in pre-Columbian America. No one term adequately describes Black people because their identities are so varied. These people can be described as Afro-Indigenous, Black Native, Indigenous and Black, Black and Native American, or Black with a tribal affiliation. Black people challenge America's tradition of racial categorization by honoring both heritages. They stubbornly refuse to conform to expectations that they must choose between being themselves and looking authentic. Ancestors of both Black and Indigenous peoples have lived in close proximity to one another and have been fighting oppression since the beginning of recorded history, when Africans and Native Americans first made contact. Black and Native Americans have persevered through insurmountable odds. Through initiatives like abolition, free towns, cross-cultural alliances, familial ties, and community building, they have discovered ways to fight back against oppression. Together and separately, they have fought for independence, giving rise to long-lived resistance movements. Do you have any opinions? Do Native Indian Americans count as Black, or do Black Americans count as descendants of slaves from Africa? Let us know in the space provided below. Are you interested in seeing more videos from us? Please show your support by clicking the bell icon and subscribing to the Chronicles of Blacks if you answered yes. Additionally, our channel has more videos for you to watch. Now that we have uncovered how Native Black Americans were systematically erased and reclassified, we must dive deeper into the lost history of these people. What other evidence supports this claim? Who were the key players in the reclassification of Black Indians? And what does this mean for the identity of Black Americans today? Let's explore the untold story of Black Indigenous Americans. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the United States. True origins of Native Black Americans. As European settlers expanded westward, they needed more land to fuel their growing empire. This meant that the indigenous populations had to be displaced. However, there was one significant problem. How do you take land from people who have a rightful claim to it? The solution was simple yet sinister. By reclassifying Native Americans as colored or Negro in government records, officials effectively erased their identity and cut off their legal claims to land. This allowed settlers to seize vast territories without resistance. This effort was led by powerful institutions, including the U.S. Census Bureau, state governments, and even religious organizations. Census takers, who were often untrained and biased, assigned racial classifications based on appearance alone. If a Native Black American looked African, they were classified as Negro. If they had mixed features, they were simply labeled as mulatto. The term Indian was slowly removed from records altogether. One of the most damaging policies came from Walter Plecker, the Registrar of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics in the early 1900s. Plecker, a known white supremacist and supporter of eugenics, worked tirelessly to ensure that Native Black Americans were stripped of their identity. Under his leadership, Virginia enacted the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which made it illegal for anyone classified as non-white to claim Indian ancestry. This law criminalized the identity of thousands of Native Black Americans, forcing them into the category of Negro on birth certificates, marriage licenses, and even death records. Plecker and his colleagues even sent letters to county clerks, demanding that they correct any records that still referred to Native ancestry. Through this systematic erasure, entire generations lost their cultural identity, their land, and their legal rights as indigenous people. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence proving that Black Americans are indigenous comes from the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations. These tribes had a long history of African and Native intermarriage, with Black Indians playing critical roles in tribal societies. However, when the U.S. government forced these tribes to relocate along the Trail of Tears, they also targeted Black Indians. Many were enslaved by wealthier tribal members, while others were pushed out of their communities altogether. After the Civil War, the U.S. signed treaties with the 5 civilized tribes, granting Black Indians, now called freedmen, full tribal citizenship. However, this did not last. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these tribes, under pressure from the federal government, began removing Black Indians from their roles. Today, thousands of Black descendants of these tribes are still fighting for recognition and citizenship rights. The Cherokee Nation, for example, has repeatedly tried to deny freedmen their rightful status, despite historical evidence proving their connection to the tribe. In Part 1, we explored how African civilizations had contact with the Americas before Columbus. This theory is further supported by linguistic, architectural, and genetic evidence. Dr. Ivan van Sertima's work, They Came Before Columbus, presents compelling arguments that ancient African explorers made transatlantic voyages long before Europeans. He highlights the presence of West African cotton plants in pre-Columbian America, similarities between Mesoamerican pyramids and Egyptian structures, ancient carvings of African-featured people in Olmec civilization, shared cultural practices, including religious rituals and agriculture. Archaeological discoveries in South America have also revealed artifacts with inscriptions resembling ancient Malian and Egyptian writing systems. Additionally, oral histories from the Mandinka people of West Africa describe voyages to a great western land across the ocean. One of the most famous accounts comes from the Malian Empire under Emperor Abubakar II. In 1311, Abubakar allegedly launched an expedition with 2,000 ships to explore the Atlantic. Many historians now believe that some of these explorers may have reached the Americas long before Columbus. If Black Africans had already established contact with indigenous Americans, then the racial classification of Black and indigenous people as separate groups is purely a European construct. One of the biggest concerns for the U.S. government today is that Native Black Americans may reclaim their indigenous rights. If proven, this could force the U.S. to return stolen lands and grant reparations to millions of people. This is why efforts to suppress this history remain strong. However, as more people take DNA tests, uncover historical documents,